Oh, okay. The exhibition, which have been on display in cities around the world, including Tel Aviv, Berlin, Warsaw, and Boston, are pasted on walls, some of which disrupt the commercialization of the public space, and others which mark the very dissolution of the public and private. This photograph is symptomatic of the latter point. The wall, a public space on a street somewhere in Berlin, has already been marked with graffiti that challenges the relationship between the public and private spheres of life. The active stills exhibit, pasted to the wall, amplifies that dissolution as it layers photographs of family members apart from their families on a space that is now no longer clearly public or private, but somehow both at once. The photograph of the scene underscores the renewed sense of civic life animated by the exhibition, not least by the couple, arm in arm, spectators who also stand in for the families and potential families that are or could be exempt from the violence exposed by the exhibition. In short, the exhibition invites a unique and active spectatorship that in this case attends not just to the individuals who have been killed, but to the civic responsibility for the private lives that have been obliterated or mutilated in the process and otherwise publicly ignored. The exhibition confronts that process by restoring the lost families to public visibility and public accountability. Just as the public art of graffiti transformed the wall from blank anonymity and enclosure to a display space for transgressive self-assertion, the photographic exhibition changes it again from a palimpsest of idiosyncratic signage to a call for engagement in the world of relationships and obligations. The multiple overlays created by the photograph of the scene and its online posting continue both lines of articulation. The exhibition becomes one part of a layered world in which each spectator can occupy multiple positions and reflect on specific encounters with the photographic subjects and other spectators. The continuous unfolding of the photographic encounter through repeated acts of spectatorship reflects both on the seemingly endless continuation of the processes of destruction. Perhaps there is some counterpoint or consolation in the exhibition's other process, the way that it stops the passersby, slows down the act of seeing the destruction, and thus provides an example of how seeing can be the first of a series of disruptions. The vernacular exhibition collates subjects and spectators for moments of alignment and identification, but its chief benefit may be a template for small acts of resistance. If so, the inability to hold their attention for long need not be a concern. Active Stills also is available as a book. By working through the volume, one's sense of inside and outside and public and private and safe and unsafe begins to shift. Not to create the illusion that you are there, but to realize that violence extends beyond spasms of direct conflict to become a system of domination pressed into the fabric of life. Likewise, instead of looking for one image or signature event, one begins to appreciate the weight of the archive, the judgment of history, the profound need to work day by day, person by person, until justice and solidarity prevail. These ideas acquire personal texture in the interviews and statements within the book by photographers and other activists, whose understanding of their work, individually and collectively, reminds us of what may be the most important lesson of all. Whatever the technology, artistry, or means of distribution, photography at its heart is an encounter with the world. I want to shift now and talk about the Philly Block Project. Photographs often have a professional feel about them, largely because amateur photographers lack curatorial skills or the opportunity to display their images in institutional spaces like museums or art galleries. Their photos, probably as yours and mine, are consigned to family photo albums, old shoeboxes, and hard drives that never achieve a public audience and are rarely seen by anyone at all. The Philly Block Project addresses this problem, and as we'll see a whole lot more, by bringing the members of Philadelphia's South Kensington neighborhood into collaboration with conceptual artist Hank Willis Thomas to, and I quote, enable residents to image themselves, unquote, as a means of discussing more challenging topics about the transition of their neighborhood. South Kensington, which you may know as North Philly, is a multi-ethnic neighborhood facing all manner of problems and transformations, not least the economic and social difficulties posed by gentrification. The primary task of the Philly Block Project was to construct a visual narrative that would preserve and celebrate the heritage of the community, past and present, by drawing upon the photographic memory of its residents. The project operated in two registers. The first was to get members of the neighborhood to participate by contributing photographs from their family archives, in some cases going back 5 generations. The second was to persuade members of the neighborhood to be photographed by members of Thomas's team. It turns out that neither of these were simple tasks. As one of the coordinators for the project put it, and I quote, there are a lot of reservations in the community about contributing images, unquote. In the words of one member of the neighborhood, they don't want to expose their families. We are talking about family history here. In the end, the power of letting the people tell their own story prevailed, and the neighborhood archive grew to over 15,000 photographs. A selection of more than 500 were treated as bricks or blown up to take place of doors and windows, and used to recreate the neighborhood as a collage of the history of its diversity across time. Added to these collages were life-size photographs of the contemporary members of the neighborhood taken by Thomas and his team. The exhibition was then displayed at the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center, which became a site for the members of the neighborhood to gather and engage the multiple issues posed by gentrification. What makes the Philly Block Project unique, especially unique actually, is how it incorporated the members of a diverse and multi-ethnic neighborhood into the production of the exhibit itself. They were not just the subjects of the image, notice, but they had contributed a part of themselves as members of a community, either through photographs from their family archive or by being photographed themselves. The last point is illustrated clearly in the photograph on the screen. For while the block is made up of hundreds of individual photographs, it is defined by no single image, but by the collection itself. The neighborhood, in short, was more than any one individual or family or any one religion or ethnicity. That said, it was quite common for particular individuals to find the portion of the block in which their photographs were displayed and to have photographs taken of them observing the scene in which they were represented, using their spectatorship to activate a sense of the community by adding one more photograph to the neighborhood archive. Just as it complicates the relationship between family and community, the project complicates the relationship between interrogation and affirmation. By seeing one's family or clan or ethnic identity in the neighborhood, one also sees how it is but one piece of and one perspective on the neighborhood. And notice this panoramic view, right, is not the typical perspective most of us have. By bringing private photo archives into public display, they become open to questioning in terms of the norms of public life, such as transparency, equality, and justice. Yet together, the archive produces a powerful elevation of the neighborhood into visibility, recognition, and legitimacy. The aggregation of individual images becomes transformed into an image of community. The Philly Block Project shows how photography's domestic distribution and accessibility and its capacity for displaying pluralism within a commodity form can be used to create models for collective association. And once again, the exhibition can transform walls, both material and virtual, of exclusion into the museum without walls, a space for imagining larger visions of collective life. I now want to turn attention to the Everyday Africa project. Of course, there is no news in recognizing that the public sphere has moved from a physical location to a virtual space. What makes the Everyday Africa project interesting is how it has used that space as a virtual museum to curate a local, vernacular retelling of the story of Africa. The project began in 2012 when Peter DeCampo and Austin Merrill, on assignment in the Ivory Coast with a grant from the Pulitzer Center, discovered that the mundane, everyday photographs they took with their cell phones told a more complex and nuanced story of Africa and Africans that was commonly represented in editorial assignments that featured refugees, famine and poverty, and the victims of war, sort of the typical genre of images we get of Africa. As they tell the story, the Western media showed no interest in the everyday Africa, where scholars bent at their desks, shopkeepers tallied receipts, adults commuted to work, children played, families ate dinner at home, a world that included architecture, theater, high fashion, and the other features of civilization. To rectify this misrepresentation, they created Everyday Africa as an Instagram feed designed to tell stories that would challenge, or I guess at least supplement, the stereotypes one finds regularly and commonly represented in the Western press. They were soon accompanied by other photographers, many of them local to the African continent. And of this writing, or at least when I wrote it, which is several months ago, the Instagram feed includes more than 5,000 photographs and over 350,000 followers. No single photograph from the project tells the whole story, and that is in some measure the point that is being made. But perhaps the first photograph taken to DeCampo is suggestive of the whole. The caption reads, "An elevator in a government building in Abidjan, Ivory Coast." The photograph is altogether ordinary. And more than that, it's mundane. The man in the foreground is casually dressed. The elevator bears the markings of everyday usage. The angle of the photograph is somewhat askance. The colors muted and subdued. There is certainly nothing exotic about the photograph or the world it represents. Indeed, how often do we think about government buildings in places like the Ivory Coast, let alone elevators, typical vehicles of modern urbanity? And yet the photograph offers a window into a regular and everyday aspect of such a life. The man's gaze and posture, like those behind him, suggests the casual indifference to strangers defining civil interaction in modern societies. Even the hushed green color scheme marks something altogether commonplace, if not actually monotonous, when placed in contrast to the bright and vibrant colors typically used to make Africa appear exotic. The banality of the image should not distract from its artistic qualities. The wash of color, despite the bright light whiting, suggests that one might look aslant at the scene, much as the man may be doing while waiting for his floor. The rows of lights repeated in the mirror image mime the operation of the camera, again suggesting a reflective moment. The turn from spectacular to vernacular optics doesn't produce a loss of meaning or responsiveness. Instead, it recalibrates one's sense of scale and channels meaning and engagement into the small things and ordinary affects of everyday life. This process could be considered a way of re-enchanting the world, and on secular terms. One important difference from the colonial optics that are being challenged by the exhibition is that this texturing and energizing of Africa occurs not in terms of its supposed primitivism or other civilizational differences, but in a manner that is directly continuous with the habitus of a spectator anywhere in the developed world. It is precisely the casual inclusiveness of such photographs that catalyzes a new form of journalism that thrives not on the decisive moment, but rather on a reality told in small pieces from multiple perspectives, and on behalf of multiple opportunities for identification. Occupying a virtual space, Everyday Africa has opened itself up to a wide array of photographers who contribute at their will. More than that, however, the project has expanded in a number of different directions. On one hand, it has developed a collaboration with the World Press Foundation to develop the African Photojournalism Data Bank on Blink, connecting local photographers with the global media network, thus extending the reach of African photographers as well as collaborating on exhibitions in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in the Netherlands. It has also begun to develop curricula as part of the Everyday Project's nonprofit organization that engages high school students by probing their stereotypical conceptions of Africa, exploring the roots of these conceptions, and then challenging them via the Everyday Africa project. Perhaps the greatest success here, however, is how the Everyday project has been appropriated and adapted by other groups, such as Everyday Middle East, Everyday American Muslim, Everyday Asia, and so on, as well as some topically fused sites such as Everyday Climate Change, all in the interest of using the virtual space of the internet to activate the civic spectatorship that is necessary for public relationship recognition and institutional accountability. So let me turn to a brief conclusion. There is no one theoretical discourse that can encompass all of photography, just as there is no one technology or practice that should represent the whole. A once radical discourse has become conventional, however, while photography's continued technological, democratic, and cultural expansions are prompting reconsideration of foundational assumptions and missed opportunities for artistic development, political advocacy, and scholarly understanding. Any alternative approach has to get beyond current habits of interpretation, and one such path is to consider how photography operates some of the time as a public art. The public image is Bob Harriman's and my attempt to outline such an approach, and this lecture takes the additional step of looking to exhibitions, and particularly vernacular exhibitions, to move beyond the limitations of our own project. An exhibition is located in a particular place or media site where one faces immediate constraints in terms of social, economic, political, and organizational circumstances. Even when limited to passersby choosing to stop unexpectedly, it displays the act of seeing in common, and by placing viewers in a direct encounter with public images, it materializes and performs the conditions of civic spectatorship and calls the viewers to a civil contract that can support solidarity and community. As Azoulay emphasizes, while defining that contract in a museum without walls, the citizen of photography enjoys the right to see because she has a responsibility toward what she sees. The exhibition materializes the relationships and thus a shift from the ethics of seeing or viewing to an ethics of the spectator, whose responsibility is toward the world and not merely the process of representation. These are the relationships that are most consequential and most at risk in any public culture, and the vernacular exhibition emphasizes how they are always need to be recreated from the ground up. For the same reason, the exhibition's ephemerality becomes another sign of photography's civic potential. It is episodic and thus might be capable of disrupting the 24/7 flow of information and misinformation that is the envelope of modern politics. It offers direct encounters and so cannot hide behind the combination of deceit, distance, audience segmentation, and repetition that is destroying the public sphere today. It is something that can be done with relatively modest resources. The question remains whether the many small exhibitions around the globe and throughout the global media environment can be more than flares of conscience. Indeed, it may be that more work needs to be done, that exhibitions and spectators alike need to be harnessed to political and social movements on behalf of photography's own democratic promise. Oh, what did I do? Stop share. There we go. I'm back. Okay, that's all I got. What do you got? Thank you, Saul. There's my good friend, Dr. Byron Craig.
Brian.
If you haven't taken a class from Dr. Craig, you really ought to.
I think most of the people who are students on there have. So I think Holly might be having some technical difficulties.
Oops.
So I think I'm going to step in. Hold on a second. Let me see if she's. Hold on one second. We're texting back and forth real quick. Hold on. Okay, so she's still not working. So I'm going to try to figure out how to field your questions. Saul, yeah, Byron's in charge now. Look out. Everyone behave on here. So I guess as a point, so we'll entertain questions. But first, John, thank you, Dr. Lucaites. Thank you very much for being the inaugural speaker for this series that Holly put together. And just real quick, I just want to say a word about Holly really quickly. She worked really hard on getting this program together and writing up the program proposal for it. So if any of your graduate students on here and you are thinking about applying for this grant next year, I would suggest you get in contact with Holly and ask her what she did and the work she put into it, because she did a fabulous job. And starting off, I have to say, with my advisor and mentor, this, of course, it's a great event because we're starting off with Dr. Lucaites. So I'll be quiet to see if anyone has any questions that they want to start off with. I think, did I see a hand up? No, well, if not, I'll start with the question really quickly. John, Dr. Lucaites, at the very end, you finished by saying something about this, how something like this might disrupt the flow of misinformation,
Right.
that we're currently experiencing in the public culture and in all sorts of ways. So I like what you said. I guess the one area that, and I'm going to ask you two questions. I think the one area that I wanted to hear more about was the Philly Block Project. And I think I remember you saying something about this, really helping us think about notions of equality and justice. And so I guess my only concern, well, I won't say my concern, I guess the only thing that I would actually want to hear more about is how you see that happening through that project. I guess the one thing that I'm thinking about, because we mentioned this notion, you mentioned the notion of gentrification. And so anytime that's at play, I think I get concerned about that. And so I just wanted to speak a little bit more about maybe how these images possibly respond to that notion of gentrification.
Yeah, well, I mean, first let's remember, right, that in large part what I'm talking about here are ultimately small efforts, right? There's this tendency to think that there are these, we're always looking for the great photograph that's going to, turn people's, persuade people overnight to change in the world. And what we have to remember is that even with oratory, that rarely ever happens, right? It's exceptional when that happens. And Harriman and I talk about some exceptional opportunities and no caption needed. But that's not the way photography or public discourse really works most of the time. And so does the Philly Block Project speak to the people that are doing, trying to create, cause the gentrification? And probably not, or at least not in any immediate or direct way. What it does, however, and what it did, right, was to bring this community of folks reflecting a wide range of differences, right, together to talk and to share. And to begin to recognize themselves as a community, and once they do that, they have a lot more, political clout, or at least the possibility for more political clout. Originally, we had all these. As I understand the problem in South Kensington, right, is that the community was fragmented, right, by all these differences, and so it made it much easier for the capitalists who are looking to gentrify to come in and buy off pieces of the community. And one of the things that happened here, right, was in the context of the project, a sense of community was created, which allowed them to battle that more, right? I mean, so I think that's the way it can work in contexts like this, right? Does that address your question?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's I like the fact that you say these small efforts.
Right.
That really hits home with it. Melissa, are you still on here? And I don't mean to call you out about,
I am.
but what you were talking about in the chat box, you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. So when you were speaking about the active stills project, it reminded me a lot about the group 7 agency that the photographer James Nachtwey, who had the big project War Photographer, that he formed, that was formed in response and reaction to Magnum Photo Agency.
Right.
Nachtwey and his colleagues were really unhappy with how Magnum was presenting photography, thinking about photography. They just didn't feel like the work that they wanted to do fit, and that they wanted their work to be political and to be activist and to make a difference. And so when you started talking about active stills, all of a sudden in my mind, I was like, oh, is this an offshoot from 7 agencies? So we're virtual, so I could go online and start looking, and it wasn't. But I like the resonance and the fact that there are numerous groups who are doing what you are talking about, and the way that you say these are small projects, small gestures,
Right.
is really important, I think, because it speaks to the fact that this is happening around the country, around the world. And I also in the chat brought up any chance I get to champion the work of our former students, I do it. We've got a former MFA in photography, Jason Reed, who's now teaching down at University of Texas San Marcos. And when he was here as a student, he started a project called Borderland Collective.
Okay.
And it's Jason working with a number of his colleagues on social documentary projects. But then the other thing Jason started to do was to teach. He got really interested in the work coming out of Duke by, and the name of the woman is escaping me right now. But basically it draws upon the work of Sol Worth back in the 60s, who taught Navajos how to make films, how to take photographs and document their own lives. And Jason has been working with immigrants in West Texas.
Okay.
You know, West Texas is this hub of where so many people who immigrate to the US end up being sent. And Jason has been working with kids specifically to photograph themselves and their own lives in order to document what they're doing. And so, but then the minute you mentioned Hank Willis Thomas as the head of the Philly Block project, I thought, oh my God, this is different. This is an individual who has a really high profile, who's really, really connected to the art world. And then I heard you say that Thomas and his colleagues are making the photographs.
Well,
and then
some of them.
And then having the people submit their own family photographs that were already made, perhaps.
Right.
So there's a difference, but I also think it's really interesting, and I really like the resonances between these.
Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts. You know, I'm very familiar with the Magnum agency work, and I would say just you know that I think it's actually quite political. But in terms of what you know the Nachtwey and his group did, I think it did reflect more of an interest in political activism, but in the end, I don't think there's a significant difference in the photographs that they produced than that was being produced by Magnum, as opposed to what's happening in the Everyday Africa project, where I think we're getting a very, very, you know, the typical photographs that the agencies want to show from Africa are, you know, about either famine and war, right, or refugees, or about people costumed in, you know, glorious colors and whatnot. And that's not what we're seeing, right, in Everyday Africa. We're seeing something that's much more, as you say, ordinary. So there's that. I'm not familiar with the Borderland Collective, though it sounds really interesting. I'll have to look into that. I guess that's all I got there.
So I'm also curious, have you ever heard of, it's on Facebook, and I think on Instagram too, it's called Humans of New York?
I have not.
Okay, Brandon Stanton, I think, is the founder, and he's been doing this now since, I want to say like 2010.
Okay.
And he
Well,
started,
I mean, one of the things that I would say, right, with respect to all of the things that you've mentioned, right, which supplement all the things that I was talking about,
right.
is that it in part is all evidence, right, to the larger point of our book, The Public Image, which is that we're facing, a paradigm shift in the way in which we think about and use photographs, right? And I think that's really important. And Bob and I didn't invent that. I mean, we got it by looking at lots and lots of contemporary work by people like Azoulay and Barbie Zelizer, and the list just goes on. David Campbell and many others. But when we began to collate all that work, we said there's something going on here, right? And it reflects a major shift, a tectonic shift from the way in which we had thought about photography up through the 60s, maybe into the 70s. So, but thank you. And I will look into the Borderlands collection. Do they have a website? Is that, I'll find it if they do.
I just posted it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, we can save it for you, John.
Okay. Well, I'll find. I see it. I got it.
I got it. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Melissa. So my chicken former student asked that I just read her question in the chat box. And this is from Amberlyn. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the issues of photography may be its ability to blend in with the background to only hold us temporarily. I wonder if you could talk again or more about how communities may feel more connected to artwork that they are specifically included in or highlighted by.
Sure. Let me think about this for a second. I mean, I'm not in the question. I'm not seeing the connection between the ephemerality of the image and how communities feel more connected to artwork. I think the point that I'm trying to make, right, is that first, the ephemerality of the image, I think, is important because things change so quickly, right? And so we don't need, the great work, the magnum opus, in order to put things on display. And because things change so quickly, different things need to be put on display regularly. So, witness the Everyday Africa Project. How people feel connected to artwork that they are included in or highlighted by, I think, by seeing themselves represented in ways that they might not otherwise see themselves represented. I mean, the Everyday Africa Project has maybe 500 photographers submitting, but it has 350,000 viewers. People aren't going to look at that for, no reason at all. And so, I think that's, where the potential action might be taking place. Certainly, it was what took place in the Philly Block Project, where people were just delighted to see themselves or other people like themselves, so much so that they went to the exhibits, right, and then had pictures of themselves taken with pictures of themselves that had already been taken. But I'm not sure that I'm answering your question. So if you wanted to clarify or push me further on that, I'd be happy to say more.
Amberlyn?
Nope. You people are so quiet. Gosh, my students, if I presented this stuff to my students, they'd be all over me. And they wouldn't be quite so kind either, I should say. There's Saul. I'm waiting for Saul to jump in.
Saul, you got something?
Sure. I actually do. I have a question. Thanks for the presentation. This was really great. And again, sorry we can't all be together because I would love to meet some of these folks and also see John. But one question I have would be that the Museum Without Walls on the surface seems to be also a critique of institutions, right? It's this idea that the museum is this kind of stuffy place where if we go there to look at exhibits, it's not as democratic, right? And so it makes sense to me to see how it lines up with yours and Bob's idea of photography. But I wonder if there's some slippage there between, on the one hand, you have a critique of institutions, and on the other hand, you all are critiquing these kind of outmoded paradigms for thinking about photographs themselves. In other words, this is a roundabout way of saying, like, does the medium as the message kind of still matter here in your all's way of thinking about photography as a democratically inflected mode of participation?
It's a good question. I think, the museum without walls, as Malraux understood it, right, was in fact a critique of museum culture, right? But it didn't rely on the use of photographs for him, right? I mean, he would use artifacts, right? He would take coins from ancient Greece and put them in relationship to coins from contemporary Britain or whatever, right? I mean, he would create these tensions, right, that would disconnect the objects from their original settings and put them in relationship to one another to get people to imagine, to raise questions, right, to interrogate, right? It's not an affirmation, it's an interrogation. What Bob and I are suggesting, and there's nothing wrong with that, we're not arguing against that at all, but we're saying photographs can do the exact same thing. And in fact, they are doing that thing right now, that the use of the exhibition, both in institutional spaces and in, for us, more importantly, vernacular spaces, is creating the same kind of relationship. Now, could you do it with things other than photographs? Sure, I suspect you could. And in fact, graffiti may in fact be one way in which that takes place, right? So, I don't think it's limited to the photograph. It's just that the photograph has increasingly become a significant mode of public discourse, right? I mean, we know that billions of photographs are taken every day. When I teach my photography, or when I taught my photography class with undergraduates, it was clear that the class was going to be a class in criticism and interpretation and whatnot. And I would walk in the first day and I would say to everybody, okay, did you bring cameras? And they'd look at me like I was crazy, right? And they said, what do you mean bring our cameras? We thought this was a class on, the history and criticism of photography. And I said, well, you don't have your cameras? And I would pull out my cell phone, right? And I said, I got mine right here. And of course, then everybody recognized, of course, but it's become such an ordinary thing, we don't even think about it, right? So the photograph becomes an especially potential medium for doing this. Does that mitigate the message as the medium? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I guess I'm also talking about the places where photographs appear, right? Like,
right.
Not an exhibition is a kind of generic term, but we could think of exhibition as a kind of medium, right?
Okay,
but I'm also thinking about the relationship that users have to how they look at photos on Instagram and how that might impact or affect the Everyday Africa exhibition or something like that. So I'm just wondering, I'm kind of trying to push in the direction of like whether that either helps sustain your argument about the the democratic possibility of these photographs, or does it interrupt it? Do we need like a hermeneutics of suspicion 2.0 to address the new areas and ways in which photographs are encountered?
I suspect that at some point we need to be critical in the reflective sense of that term, right? Of the ways in which these exhibitions are being developed and used, and then comparing exhibitions against exhibitions and whatnot. I mean, it's turtles all the way down, as it were, in that sense, right? I mean, we never get away from the need for such critique. But I don't think that's where necessarily we need to start. Others?
So just let me say really quickly, one of the classes had to leave. They had to get back to their class and do presentations. And let me, well, Holly's telling me we're starting to wrap. We're running over, so if I could wrap up in the next few, that would be good.
All right.
But let me just read a statement she asked me to read for her. Thank
Okay.
you all so much for coming tonight. The next speaker event will be White Sight, Visual Politics of Whiteness with NYU Professor Dr. Nicholas Mirzoff. This talk will explore the contemporary surveillance and the creation of what Mirzoff calls white sight, the persistence and continued force of white ways of seeing and making white space. This will be October 21st, so please keep an eye out for that. And of course, John, you're invited back to come in and listen and give us some more knowledge on that one. Should be an interesting
Be
talk.
happy to. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, Mirzoff is, you know, it's just a prolific writer. I mean, I don't know how he does it. You know, I mean, it took us, you know, 15 years to write 2 books. He's knocking them out like, you know, nobody's business. But they're great. I mean, you know, I really like his work a lot. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to come back.
Sure. Well, I'm helping him. I help him, John, a lot. So that's how he gets them out so quickly.
Well, that's probably it. Yeah.
Wait, did Saul leave? I guess he left also.
He left, yeah.
Okay, so are there anybody else have any comments to make or? No? Oh,
Just to say thank you.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you. Apparently, I have my camera going in the wrong direction, but
Yeah.
I do want to. I do, as the sponsor for the research series at ISU, and in my role as the Vice President of Research and Associate Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies, I really appreciate, or my wall appreciates you coming out, and thank you so much, Holly, for this wonderful series that you proposed and put together, and really appreciate the Wonsuk Kim College of Fine Arts like taking the lead on the whole, and the School of Wonsuk Kim School of Art taking the lead on organizing it all. But Holly did yeoman's work in the proposal, and an awesome lineup. Super excited. This is so outside my field. I'm a chemist, but it was an awesome talk and like really cool to listen to and see the interactions. And you know, hate to interject myself, but I really do appreciate all the work that you guys did. And this might be the only one where I get to talk. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay.
All right, anyone else? Are we good? As we say in the Baptist Church, the Black Baptist Church, hearts and minds are good. All right. Well, John, thank you very much. And
you.
those of you that know, John was my dissertation advisor and put up with a lot from me. So I appreciate you being here and doing this for Holly. Means a lot. All right. Well, thanks, folks. And on behalf of Holly, thank you for coming and good night. And sorry, Holly's camera. I don't know what happened. Her screen just went completely blank. So,
You know, technology is not something to rely on. I mean, this is a good reminder of that.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, everyone. Well, have a good evening. John, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, talk to you soon. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you guys so much.
Okay. Bye, Caleb. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
It's like
Talk to you soon.